This is the history that refuses to stay buried. In the heart of Europe, in the year 1618, a single act lit the fuse of a catastrophe. A window in Prague. 2 men hurled into the void. The defenestration, they called it. It was meant as protest, as humiliation. Instead, it became the spark for 30 years of fire. Europe was a tinderbox. For a century, the continent had been divided by faith. Catholic against Protestant. Kings, emperors, and princes hiding their ambitions behind the language of God. The Holy Roman Empire, an empire in name only, was a fractured patchwork of states, cities, and rival lords. It was a house of glass, and the stone had just been thrown. What followed was not a single war. It was a plague of wars, layered one upon another. A war of religion, of politics, of dynasties, of survival. Armies marched not just against their enemies, but against the land itself. Fields were stripped, villages burned, towns emptied, all in the name of faith and power. At first, it was the Protestants of Bohemia who rose. They placed their own king on the throne, defying the Habsburg emperor. But the emperor's wrath came quickly. Catholic armies descended upon them with fire and sword. At the Battle of White Mountain, outside Prague in 1620, the revolt was crushed in blood. Heads of rebel leaders were nailed to the city gates, left as a warning to all who might defy. Yet the victory did not bring peace. It only drew more wolves into the field. Lutheran princes in the north feared their turn was coming. Catholic Spain saw a chance to strengthen its grip on the empire. Protestant Denmark joined the fight, claiming defense of faith, but lusting for land. Each power cloaked itself in holy words, but beneath the prayers lay greed. And the armies that filled Europe were not soldiers of discipline and honor. They were mercenaries, men who sold their swords to the highest bidder. Germans, Italians, Croats, Spaniards, French. They spoke a dozen tongues, but all spoke the same language of hunger and plunder. They marched under banners of Christ, but their true altar was the loot of war. Villages they passed were stripped bare, doors smashed, women dragged into alleys, children starved as winter set in. Entire provinces fed the armies like carcasses feed vultures. And when there was nothing left, the soldiers turned on one another, robbing, killing, devouring the very land that paid them. This was not war as Europe had known it. This was war without end. The war that would erase 1/3 of Germany's people and leave the rest wandering among ruins. And it had only just begun. The fire spread. What began in Bohemia now engulfed the empire. Armies rose and fell. Kings pledged and betrayed. The soil of Europe drank deeper and deeper of its people's blood. After the Protestant cause was crushed in Prague, the Catholic emperor sought to root out resistance across the German lands. Edicts banned Protestant worship. Churches were seized, pastors driven into exile. But faith, once threatened, hardens like stone. Lutheran princes in the north refused to bow. They formed leagues, raised armies, and sought allies abroad. It was Denmark that first came to their aid. King Christian IV rode into the empire as defender of the Protestant faith. But his cause was more than holy. He sought land, riches, and glory for his crown. His armies marched into Germany, banners high, yet soon met the iron wall of the emperor's generals. At Dessau Bridge in 1626, Christian's forces were shattered. His men, mercenaries like all others, fled into the fields, looting as they ran. In the aftermath, Catholic armies swept through the Protestant lands with fire and iron. Entire villages were erased. The cries of peasants filled the smoke. Denmark's king limped home in defeat, leaving his allies abandoned to ruin. But even this did not quench the flames. For across the Baltic another king watched, Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden. He was no drunken opportunist. He was disciplined, brilliant, a lion of war. In 1630, he crossed into Germany, his army of Swedes and Finns marching in order, singing hymns as drums beat. To many Protestants, it seemed as though God himself had sent a savior. At Breitenfeld in 1631, near Leipzig, Gustavus met the imperial army in open battle. It was a slaughter. The Catholic lines broke under Swedish cannon and disciplined fire. For the first time, the emperor's power trembled. Protestant cities cheered. The Lion of the North had roared. Yet victory brought no mercy. Mercenary still filled both armies. After Breitenfeld, villages along the Swedish march were stripped bare, livestock stolen, families left to starve. Discipline could not cage hunger. Soldiers fought for bread as fiercely as for faith. The war no longer belonged to God, if it ever had. It belonged to survival. Each campaign brought new allies, new betrayals. France, though Catholic, began to feed Protestant armies with gold, anything to weaken the Habsburgs. Princes who swore loyalty to Emperor one month opened their gates to Sweden the next. And everywhere, the common people paid the price. A peasant in Saxony did not care whether mass or sermon was spoken in Latin or German. He cared only that his field had been burned 3 times in a single year. His sons dragged into armies that never came home. His wife clutching the last crust of bread. The years stretched on. Disease rode with the soldiers, devouring what hunger spared. Cities emptied, not from sieges alone, but from plague that seeped into every cellar, every barn, every church. No prayer stopped it, no banner commanded it, and yet still, the armies marched. Still, kings and emperors declared that the war was holy. Still, men died with the names of God on their lips, even as their stomachs gnawed with emptiness. The 30 Years' War had entered its middle years, and the worst was still to come. The war had devoured princes, peasants, and kings, but it was not yet satisfied. The Lion of the North, Gustavus Adolphus, seemed unstoppable. His victories at Breitenfeld and Lech made Protestants believe that deliverance was at hand. But in 1632, at the Battle of Lutzen, the lion was slain. Amid gunpowder and fog, the Swedish king fell from his horse, cut down in the chaos. His army won the field, but their savior lay dead in the mud. The hope of Protestants dimmed, but the fire of war did not fade. Sweden fought on, his generals holding ground. Yet the death of Gustavus left a vacuum. Into that void stepped France. Though Catholic, France feared the Habsburg dynasty more than it feared Protestantism. Cardinal Richelieu, the spider at the center of French power, declared that politics, not faith, would decide the war. French gold, French armies, French ambition poured into Germany. Now, the mask of religion fell away. Catholic fought Catholic, Protestant fought Protestant, and Europe's map became a chessboard of survival. Armies swelled larger than ever, fed not by faith but by coin and conquest. But coin could not feed soldiers alone, so they fed on the land. Villages were stripped to bone. Grain was stolen before it ripened. Vineyards crushed beneath boots. Even corpses were robbed for boots, belts, and bread. The peasants became shadows, wandering from ruin to ruin, hunted by hunger as much as by soldiers. Plague followed armies like a second shadow. In Magdeburg, the sickness struck before the soldiers did. Yet when imperial troops stormed the city in 1631, they slaughtered without mercy. 20,000 civilians, burned and butchered, the smoke blotting out the sky. The Magdeburg wedding, they called it. Mocking, obscene. The ashes of the dead scattered over the Elbe. Magdeburg was not alone. Würzburg, Heidelberg, countless towns met the same fate. Bells that once rang for prayer rang only to warn of fire and pillage. Entire districts became graveyards. By mid-war, 1 in 3 Germans was gone. Still, the war sprawled wider. French and Swedish armies clashed with Imperial and Spanish troops across the Rhine, the Alps, the Danube. Fields of wheat became fields of bones. Soldiers froze to death in winter campaigns, their bodies left as warnings along the roads. Civilians who scavenged their corpses caught the plague. Death became ordinary. Yet still, kings spoke of honor, of destiny, of God. In Paris, Richelieu whispered strategy, feeding gold into endless war. In Madrid, Spain strained to hold its empire, bleeding silver from the New World into German mud. In Vienna, the Habsburg emperors prayed for victory while their subjects starved. And in the silence between battles, wolves returned to Europe's forests, feeding on the unburied dead. Survivors whispered that even the animals had become fat from war. The 30 Years' War was no longer about faith. It was about survival. And survival itself was becoming impossible.
30 years had passed since the first men were hurled from a window in Prague. Europe was no longer the same continent. It was a scar, and the wound still bled. By the 1640s, exhaustion hung over every kingdom. Armies still marched, but their banners drooped, their songs faded. Even kings had grown weary of war that devoured everything and gave nothing. France and Sweden pressed on against the Habsburgs, each seeking land and influence. Spain bled itself dry, its empire faltering. The Holy Roman Emperor prayed for relief as his realm crumbled into famine and ash. Battles raged, but the fire was burning itself out. At Rocroi in 1643, French cannon tore through the pride of Spain, the invincible tercios. The battlefield was littered with their corpses, the myth of Spanish dominance broken. Yet the victory brought no peace. Only more years of marching, burning, starving. Germany, once a land of thriving cities and fertile plains, had become a graveyard. 1 in 3 Germans was dead. Villages stood empty, their fields reclaimed by weeds. Churches crumbled, bells silent. Survivors wandered like ghosts, selling their last belongings for a crust of bread. Children grew up not knowing peace, only smoke and ruin. In 1648, the powers of Europe finally gathered to end it. In the Westphalian towns of Münster and Osnabrück, diplomats argued for years while armies still clashed. The treaties they forged redrew Europe's map. Princes gained independence. France expanded. Sweden secured its place. The Habsburg dream of a united Catholic empire was broken forever. But what did peace mean to the survivors? No treaty brought back the dead. No signature rebuilt the homes reduced to ash. For the common people, peace was silence. The silence of empty villages, of overgrown fields, of graves unmarked and unremembered. The 30 Years' War had begun as a quarrel of faith, a spark of defiance in a Prague window. It ended as a lesson in ruin, that when war is loosed without restraint, it consumes everything, faith, crown, and flesh alike. 30 years of fire, 30 years of hunger, 30 years of death. And when it was over, Europe could no longer remember what it had been before. This was not just a war. It was apocalypse, disguised as politics, dressed as religion. A war that erased millions and scarred a continent for centuries. This was the 30 Years' War. the history that refuses to stay buried.